What would it take for me to join the Conservative Party? What policies would the Conservative Party need to adopt for me to be willing to join that party and for me to be willing to wear like a t-shirt like in public saying that I'm a member of that public party, for me to wear a jacket and go to their events? Number one answer is drug addiction, the drug issue, the drug culture. There is a real opportunity for conservative parties or the Republican Party to bring in someone like me as a supporter by being the party that is really going to solve the drug problem. I want the destination to be a culture and a country of sobriety.
Drug abuse and addiction cost American society more than $740 billion annually in lost workplace productivity, healthcare expenses, and crime-related costs.
Issue number 3, I'm going to skip number 2 and come back to it. I think we've got to come to some kind of reasonable accommodation about what is the meaning of capitalism in the future. If you just openly say, okay, the society we want to have in the future is, like Denmark, a capitalist society, but a capitalist society that cares about the poor, a capitalist society that's capable of addressing problems like healthcare is too expensive, education is too expensive. The result is a very, very broad category of being pro-capitalist that can include a lot of people who are now on the left and on the right. All right.
So what's number 2?
What is number 2? Immigration/refugee policy.
Okay, bring it on.
So now I want to mention 2 things that the 2 biggest obstacles that prevent me from ever wearing the conservative name. First one, you can guess, you've heard a million times. Indigenous people, First Nations, Native Americans. I mean, you call yourself a conservative party. What the hell is it you're trying to conserve? Not Ojibwe culture, apparently, right? Not the Ojibwe language. Whew, okay, and then the other point, you also could guess from the name of this YouTube channel. So this is my point 2 on my 2-point list for why I wouldn't end up with a conservative party, is separation of church and state. If the Conservative Party or the Republican Party remains the party of Christian theocracy, I can't have anything to do with it. For reasons that'll soon become clear to you in the audience, I decided to challenge myself as a thought exercise. What would it take for me to join the Conservative Party? What policies would the Conservative Party need to adopt for me to be willing to join that party? And I'm not talking about a rebranding where they change their name. For the Conservative Party to still be called the Conservative Party, and for me to be willing to wear like a t-shirt like in public saying that I'm a member of that public party, for me to wear a jacket and go to their events and say, yeah, I rep this party, they support this policy, therefore I support them. Got my girl Melissa on the other end of the line. And Melissa is American. So for her, the question is exactly the same, but it would be the Republican Party. And if you're watching this in some other country, it's some other question. So you're going to see my approach to this is pragmatic. I'm not going to make up a bunch of policies that the Conservative Party or the Republican Party could never possibly pursue or support. My number one answer, keeping it all the way real, is drug addiction, the drug issue, the drug culture. There is a real opportunity for conservative parties or the Republican Party to bring in someone like me as a supporter by being the party that is really going to solve the drug problem. Because I listen to left-wing news, I listen to left-wing media, I read left-wing sources all the time. Okay, what did the Obama presidency do about the drug crisis in America? I mean,
not a damn thing.
Can we look back at 8 years of Obama being in power and say, wow, the left, they really took on the drug addiction issue. It really got better. That was really a turning point in our history, those 8 years where the drug problem got better. No, in those 8 years, the drug problem got worse and worse and worse. Currently in Canada, we just had the turning point in history. Melissa, you were with me in Canada when it happened. Marijuana was legalized, right? So we've become more, but you were there when for the first time there were like corner stores, there were normal shops selling marijuana. So I know from a certain perspective, you can say there's a turning point there. But you and I, Melissa, we've lived through, what used to be the crack epidemic, what used to be the crack epidemic and the heroin epidemic has expanded and expanded into being the fentanyl epidemic and the K2 epidemic. And none of the older epidemics went away. We've still got an alcoholism epidemic, in case you didn't know. Yeah. And when you walk the streets of Los Angeles or you walk the streets of Vancouver, you see it and feel it and smell it and hear it. Oh, God. Oh, yeah. I don't even want to get... You remember, so that was the first time you saw someone with a needle in their arm in public. I mean, where you really...
That's right. Yeah, and I went and visited my brother in San Francisco a couple months ago, and again, I saw someone openly shooting up on the street. Mm-hmm. Needle in arm, yeah.
Well, what burns me is, so I listen to left-wing sources like the Young Turks, and they often talk about poverty, and what they mean is drug addiction. Like, they'll literally make a statement about people living in tents on the streets of one city or another.
Right.
I was looking at Philadelphia last night, documentary about Philadelphia. They had a huge number of people living in tents. It's not poverty. And left-wing groups like the Young Turks, they will, with zero irony, point the finger at the White House, point the finger at Donald Trump, and say that he's lying about the economy doing well, saying that he's lying about the unemployment rate, because they claim, just look at these people living in tents, therefore poverty is terrible. No.
Yeah, that's pretty dishonest, yeah.
It's the drug problem. It's the drug crisis, and there's a really deep disadvantage on the left, or prejudice in effect, that will prevent them from getting tough on drugs, from getting serious about drugs. And let me just add too. Okay, so when I say I'd be willing to support, this is the first check mark that would make me willing to support the Conservative Party. I want a long-term end goal. I want the destination to be a culture and a country of sobriety that's predominantly sober, where drug use is a very minor. And I'm willing to look at examples like Japan. I'm willing to look at examples like Singapore. I'm willing to look at examples like communist China. I'm willing to look at countries that have had really, really tough anti-drug laws, and where as a result drug addiction is a really minor, really rare phenomenon in society, instead of being a predominant part of the landscape, put it that way, that people are expected to live with and tolerate, with unbelievable cost to society. What was the number I gave you last night? 750 million? 750 million? What the hell? Do you still have it?
That, yeah.
Okay, why don't you get the number? It was an estimate for what the cost is to the American taxpayer, the total damage done by drug addiction in America. And of course, this includes prison and rehabilitation programs and crime and so on. Did you get the number, babe?
Drug abuse and addiction cost American society more than $740 billion annually in lost workplace productivity, healthcare expenses, and crime-related costs.
Okay. So that's a generous estimate, but still 700. We're into the billions. We're somewhere into the hundreds of billions. Issue number 3. I'm going to skip number 2 and come back to it. I think we've got to come to some kind of reasonable accommodation about what is the meaning of capitalism in the future. So, babe, I'm mentioning this second, even though I had it third. I recently heard an economist giving an interview, and I got interested in buying his book. I've asked Melissa to buy this book for me. And when I heard this guy talking, I assumed he was quite conservative. I assumed he was maybe at the left wing of the Republican Party, like he was a Republican who was willing to admit that caring for the poor matters and this kind of thing.
Yes.
And then I checked the guy's blog, and he considers himself further to the left than Bernie Sanders. And to me, that's a really interesting illustration of how that broad category can include everyone from conservatives to Bernie Sanders. Like, if you just openly say, okay, the society we want to have in the future is, like Denmark, a capitalist society, but a capitalist society that cares about the poor, a capitalist society that's capable of addressing problems like healthcare is too expensive, education is too expensive. The result is a very, very broad category of being pro-capitalist that can include a lot of people who are now on the left and on the right. So do you have anything to say about that, baby? I mean, like, in part, you've just been living with me for 2 years, and you've been hearing me agonizing about what's going on in politics. And yeah, I mean, what is the opposite of communism? What is the alternative to the far left now? It seems to me there's this really, really broad category that goes a long, long way.
What is it about Denmark that they're able to have these social programs that America can't have?
Right. So, I mean, I guess the point there is, one, you would need the Conservative Party to accept the basic premise of taxing the rich and stop being the party that perpetually promises tax breaks for the rich. A party that just says, look, if you want to be like Denmark, if you want to provide these things to society, there's going to be a certain level of taxation for the rich. And I mean, I guess the second thing is asking the Conservative Party or the Republican Party to accept privatization as such does not necessarily mean improvement. Like, when I was a kid, there was this really naive right-wing neoconservative thing going on. Neoconservatism that was neoconservatism was later marketed as neoliberalism, but it started as neoconservatism. Interesting case of rebranding or relabeling there. The assumption was that if you took a prison operated by the government and then you privatized it, that somehow this prison would become better and more efficient for society and the prisoners and everyone. That was unbelievably jejune and just wrong. I mean, it didn't work. We tried that for several decades. We tried the privatize everything approach to neoliberalism, neoconservatism, and conservatism, and it has failed. So, I mean, so your question very simply was, well, why can't we be like Denmark? Why can't we have the nice things Denmark have? I think those are the very basic assumptions. And I don't think I'm being unreasonable in saying that a Conservative Party or Republican Party could come to accept that kind of premise. No? All right.
So what's number two?
What is number two? Immigration/refugee policy.
Okay, bring it on.
So this is where people think I'm really conservative because the left is never going to deal with it, right? So could we have, it's not too much to ask, could we have a Conservative Party or Republican Party that openly rejects and overturns the bullshit propaganda that infinite numbers of immigrants are good and wonderful for society, that accepting infinite numbers of refugees and asylum seekers is good for society? Can we have a Conservative Party or Republican Party that just openly rejects that whole discourse? Because the left is never going to do it. The left is debating whether or not they should have entirely open borders. That's become completely surreal on the left. So sure, I'm looking to a Conservative Party or a Republican Party to have a get tough on immigration stance, get tough, basically quit the current United Nations treaties and commitments to accepting refugees, and totally overturn the neoliberal tradition, the neoliberal attitude towards immigration. That's what I'm looking for.
Okay.
And by the way, I'm actually not racist. I mean, I live in Taiwan right now. I lived a large part of my adult life in Asia. You know, I grew up in downtown Toronto, surrounded by basically every ethnic group that exists on Earth, Chileans and Jamaicans, what have you. But guess what? When you look at really successful societies like Japan and Switzerland, they've had a mature attitude towards immigration, as opposed to basically going into a downward spiral of dealing with the guilt of colonial history, trying to compensate by inviting representatives of the colonized people to come and live in your country. And by the way, like, I get it. I think that's exactly what happened in England. England was in this horrible position of having to look at the history of their empire, and they're responsible for genocide on like 3 continents or more. You know, there was one, and they say, okay, well now we'll make it all better by having, a little India in London and having a little Jamaica and so on. Like, as if it's somehow compensating for the history of what you did to India and what you did to Jamaica as a colonial power and a slave trading power and an opium trading power, to now have neighborhoods of immigrants in London. I get it. I get the emotional and ideological function that has. But I mean, right now, looking at the present and future of Canada, it's just ridiculous to me to think that the future of these countries is continuously importing more labor, whether it's at the high end or the low end of the pay
I
scale.
have two things to say and two things I would like to hear your opinion on.
Hit it.
I listened to an interview with Andrew Yang earlier today. And in this brief interview, he
Right.
said that immigration is not the problem in terms of Americans losing their jobs. It is automation.
Yes. So that's been tested empirically and it's factually false. So I'm glad you asked this. I had a viewer send me a link to an article, and I really considered doing a YouTube video about it, but it was very boring and very difficult to explain the technical details. But long story short, the math has been done, and the very simple fact is that when you examine the claims made by Andrew Yang, and it's not only Andrew Yang, when you examine the claims made by Andrew Yang and some academics that mechanization, automation, robots, that's responsible for the loss of jobs, it is factually false. Now, if you want it in a form you can understand, that hypothesis, when you look at the manufacturing industry in Detroit, is it the case that those jobs disappeared to Mexico because Mexico has a higher level of automation, they have better quality robots? Did the jobs relocate elsewhere because of higher levels of automation, mechanization, and so on? No. The jobs left because of lower wages in Mexico. Why did jobs relocate broadly? So not just the car industry. When you look across many industries, why did jobs relocate from the United States to China? Is it because in China they have higher quality mechanization, higher rates of automation? No. And there are methods we can use economically to really measure that, to measure how many jobs disappeared because of robots, in a word, because of automation and mechanization, how many disappeared because they moved elsewhere where wages are lower. So those are measurable things in economics. It's not surprising. What else do economists have to do but measure those kind of things? And when you do the math and when you look at it, no, it is completely false that historically up to this point, what's happened under NAFTA and deindustrialization, it is not due to, put it this way, deindustrialization was not caused by mechanization. It was not caused by higher levels of information technology. So, another thing I'd point out is when you actually look at the numbers for General Motors, it's actually amazing how few jobs left the United States. Bernie Sanders uses those numbers where he says, 30% of jobs with General Motors disappeared during this period with, permanent trade relations with China. PNTR is the term. And so I was like, wait a minute, only 30% decline? So sorry, that's from memory, but it's something like that. When you're actually going through even the Bernie Sanders claims about that, you're like, well, wait, that's not all that bad. And the reason is that the jobs that stayed in America were, as you can imagine, jobs related to finances and design. There were different kind of higher level jobs that remained for General Motors in the United States. But the manufacturing jobs left. And the numbers for that are surprising too. So, the fact that today people like designers and even, people doing financial planning, the fact that those people use computers, the computers don't actually replace them. The computers don't eliminate those jobs. So that is a significant and interesting little digression here, is to what extent is the threat of future automation real? Maybe we can debate that. But historically, up to this point, what Andrew Yang is saying is completely false. So, and the facts are out there for people who actually want to look into it.
Okay.
So, but look, let's come back to the original premise. The original premise was the threat to our jobs is not immigration, it's mechanization. Okay, well, quantitatively also, you can say as a fact, the threat to our jobs is not immigration to the United States. It was the jobs actually leaving the United States. It was jobs actually leaving America for Mexico, leaving America for China. And that's part of the same calculus. If people immigrate to the United States, then they're paid the same wages as Americans. They're not earning the same wages they would earn if they'd stayed in China. So there is actually an underlying significant point there. Yeah, go on.
Okay, yeah. The other thing is, I read an article the other day that, I've heard about Japan, that they have a declining population and more people there are of the elderly population, just because.
Yes, huge issue for Japan. Correct, yeah.
Well, I was reading an article about Korea, that Korea is also starting to experience this problem and that the birth rate is not replacing, and they spoke highly of countries such as the United States and Canada because they have more open border policies.
Yeah.
Their population, our population in America is continuing to grow, and they don't contribute that to the people
Right.
that are here, having more children. It's
Right.
that we have immigration policy that is allowing for more and more population growth. So what do you think about that?
Okay, so all right, this is a great question. I'm really happy to digress on this. The Japanese model of the economy has advantages and disadvantages. One of the advantages is that they have lower unemployment during a recession than we have during a boom. Just go to Google right now. I think you can just do this on your computer. Babe. Just do Google Japan unemployment rate. So currently it's way up at 2%. 2% unemployment, right? But when you look back, even look at the point. So, I mean, you're looking at the lost decade there in the 1990s, right? So that's supposedly this terrible period of the Japanese economy. There was this unbelievable period of crisis, and in some ways, sincerely so. It was a real economic crisis. Can you imagine an economic crisis with 2% unemployment? Okay,
Amazing.
so okay. Now I just want to say I actually formally researched this when I was at university. There have been false claims that Japan's unemployment numbers are somehow fake or fraudulent, or that the government calculates it in a manner different from the United States of America. I formally wrote an essay about it. I did the research and looked into that at university. It wasn't a long essay. It was a short essay, as I recall. But no, that's not true. That is a myth made up in the Western press because people feel jealous of the unemployment rate. They're like, oh, well, they don't count. They don't do the math the same way we do. Their numbers don't count. No. When you look into it, you can do the details. The numbers count. That really is the unemployment rate in Japan is calculated the same way we calculate unemployment. Their unemployment rate is amazingly low. Okay, so quality of education in Japan is very high. Unemployment rate is very low. Crime is almost zero. Again, you can look into the crime statistics. It's shocking, right? Japan has a lot of advantages. Are there disadvantages? Yes, like fascism. A lot of Japanese are basically fascists. A lot of Japanese are unbelievably racist and xenophobic and have authoritarian hierarchical attitudes that would also shock you. Now, I don't think there's a simple cause and effect relationship there. Obviously the history and culture of Japan is unique in many ways. So yeah, it's an interesting question. Look, put it this way. How much do you want to be like Japan? And how much do you want to be like Denmark? They're both very, very positive examples we can learn from. But I don't think it's a really simple question of just imitating Japan to the greatest extent possible. But no, any discourse about that, any discourse about... Well, sorry, I did a much longer essay about the history of immigration policy in Japan. So I just mentioned I did specifically research that. And I had an extreme left-wing professor who hated me for doing it. She gave me a low grade, low by my standards, and she really discouraged me from writing about it because for her as a left-winger, an essay dealing with the reality of immigration policy in Japan, it was the opposite of everything she wanted to believe in. She was one of the people, she believed in having no borders at all. She wanted unlimited immigration alterations. It was like, well, here's what Japan did, and here's how it worked out. So yeah, so one really brief thing about that. I don't think I've ever mentioned this on YouTube. When you look at the statistics for immigration to Japan, they're actually false the other way. They are massively overstated. Japan has much less immigration than the statistics indicate for very interesting historical reasons. this is only one example, but it's the most important example. They have a population of people who are ethnically Korean, who live in Japan and who have lived there continuously since before World War II. So most of them now are born after World War II, but they're the children and grandchildren. And they remain legally foreigners in Japan by their own choice. They chose to reject Japanese citizenship. So every year, often multiple times per year, they're registered as new immigrants arriving in Japan, even though they've been living there continuously since before World War II. So they have actually massively inflated immigration numbers. And for some person, I did the math. I was like, okay, well, how many immigrants are there if we delete these false and misleading categories of immigrants who are not really new immigrants? And yes, it is close to zero. They are an extremely low immigration society. You can see that already when you look at the statistics, but then if you break down the categories of statistics, yeah, it's even lower. I think there's an interesting hypothetical question to ask. You know, is London, England, better off as a city because it's become a cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, multilingual city? Is that better than if London, England had remained 90%, British people? That's an interesting question. However, the question we're asking now is, given that you already are a cosmopolitan city, it's already done. Right. What's the argument for more immigration and for more refugees? Welcoming in all of the people from Afghanistan whose country has been destroyed by CIA policy. Well, guess what? If you open the doors to everyone who'd like to escape Afghanistan, it's going to be a lot of people. And Afghanistan and Syria and so on and Iraq. These are not small numbers of people. This will be waves and waves and waves that'll transform the future of your society. So I just say we're not starting from the 19th century. We're starting from the year 2019. And, I don't really see any sincere discourse on the left or the right that looks at Vancouver, Canada today, to use a Canadian example, looks at Vancouver and thinks, wow, you know what this city needs? This city needs more Asian immigration. That's what's going to improve the city. At this point in Vancouver, we got it, okay? We already have. And again, I speak Chinese. I'm very pro-Chinese in my view of the world. Believe me, I'm very biased in favor of Chinese immigrants. I like Chinese immigrants more than I like white people. I really do. My biases lean that way. However, I've lived in China, I've lived in Taiwan, I've lived in Vancouver. I think you've got to be insane to be looking at Vancouver and saying, well, what we need right now is another 500,000 Chinese immigrants, or even immigrants specifically from Taiwan. It makes no sense to me economically, culturally, politically, or in any other way. And obviously that will get me banned from woke Twitter. That'll get me banned. John Sakars is not going to hang out with me anymore. It's really a shame, John. It's really a shame, John. I was at that dance party, John. I saw you sitting there pathetically by the side of the dance floor, sitting there all alone. He was. He's a mopey guy, John. His communism has not made him happy in life, John.
That's what the Republican candidates are going to have to. Well, sorry,
that's my proposal. So those are the three issues. Those are the three issues. So now I want to mention two things that the two biggest obstacles that prevent me from ever wearing the conservative name. First one, you can guess, you've heard a million times. Indigenous people, First Nations, Native Americans. Right? It's a huge issue. So you guys may not know this. Bernie Sanders' book, it's just off camera here. There we go. Bernie Sanders' book, Our Revolution, it does have a chapter on Native Americans. It's a short chapter, but there is a chapter in here that says, I'm Bernie Sanders. I care about Native Americans. I always have. Always will. It tells a bunch of anecdotes about the time he went to visit this and that Indian reservation and talk to the chiefs and stuff. So there is a chapter in here on that. There's really no way I can ever support a conservative party or Republican party if they don't take a very clear stand on First Nations people, First Nations languages, what the future of that is supposed to be. And sure, the history matters a little bit. If you want to have National Sorry Day, like Australia has, the apology for the past thing. I'm not really into the past. I'm really into the future. I really want a political commitment for what the future is going to be on this issue, right?
Yes, I find it hard to believe that most people that run the Conservative Party would be in favor of your language revitalization.
Right. Right. So
It just
that's
seems antithetical to what they want.
right.
They want.
Well, okay, but that compare to, I mean, I'm glad I did point two as point three there. I'm glad I did point two last. I think that can be linked in a powerful and meaningful way to the skepticism about immigration and refugee policy, right? Where you say, look, Canadian identity isn't English identity. What really matters is the fate of the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Mohawk, and then questioning, if we keep having more and more waves of new immigrants from China and Asia and Africa, how are those people going to participate? And isn't this just going to complete the genocide of our native people and languages? So I think you can revive those languages and start to make that a bulwark of saying, well, there's some kind of identity or culture or historical continuum here that you're trying to conserve. I mean, you call yourself a conservative party. What the hell is it you're trying to conserve? Not Ojibwe culture, apparently, right? Not the Ojibwe language. So it gives conservatives something to conserve. It's kind of a weird positive spin. And I think it does connect to that question also. Because I don't think you have a leg to stand on if your point is that you want to reduce immigration so that you can preserve the hockey league. Ice hockey is for everyone. anyone can immigrate to Canada tomorrow and participate in the hockey league. Not just anyone can immigrate to Canada and actually learn Cree or Ojibwe or connect to that history or that culture or that language. Currently, there are no schools for you to study those languages. And trust me, I would know. I have a long email correspondence with all the universities about just how hard it is to learn those languages in Canada.
That's right.
Whew, okay, and then the other point, you also could guess from the name of this YouTube channel. So this is my point two on my 2-point list for why I wouldn't end up with the Conservative Party, is separation of church and state. If the Conservatives can't really commit to getting over this connection they have to Jesus and abortion, I'm out. I can't be a part of you guys at all. If the Conservative Party or the Republican Party remains the party of Christian theocracy, I can't have anything to do with it. And that's probably easier for Americans to deal with than Canadians, because at least in America, you guys do have a constitution that sets down in principle separation of church and state. The Constitution also supports the progress of science over religion and stuff. But that's asking a lot from the Conservative Party. And if they do that, if they take an aggressively secular stance, that will let them finally get rid of the homophobia issue in the party, right? Because as long as you're the party of traditional Christian values, then you're the party of homophobia, you're the party that's opposed to legal abortion. There are a lot of real limitations to what conservative can ever mean or be in practice as long as you're connected to that. So it would be convenient, even if it were completely cynical, for conservatives and Republicans just say, look, we're drawing a line, and from now on...
Hey, there might be hope.
Yeah.
Look, Trump got in office, and he is really not somebody that a Christian... surprisingly, he got voted in, but,
I know, it's
really
such
not embodying Christian values. I'll tell you what.
Who is less Christian than Donald Trump? It's really true. And for me, I'm old enough to remember Bill Clinton when he would go to church, and there was this news footage of him and his wife standing there with glowing faces in church. I mean, it's completely cynical. Who on earth is less Christian than, Bill Clinton and his wife? Donald Trump is less Christian. Donald Trump is the least Christian person I know, and I'm an atheist Jew ex-Buddhist, okay? Okay, babe, let's wrap it up there. Thanks for hanging in with me. For you in the audience, if you thought this was an insincere discourse in any way, I just remind you, when you live in a political system that has only two alternatives, if you're sincerely interested in political progress, you've got to take an interest in reforming and revitalizing both. I would love to see a reform and revitalization of the conservative tendency, if only because that would then force more better ideas, better progress on whatever the anti-conservative tendency is. I definitely do not want to live in a society where political discourse is a meaningless debate between Christian conservatives and crypto communists.